Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is Pastor Jeff Short, your Bible teacher and cultural analyst. And today we're going to be looking at another aspect of culture. I just saw a documentary on the famous Vanderbilt family. This was probably the richest family in the United States 150 years ago or so. And Cornelius Vanderbilt was perhaps the richest man in America at one point. And this documentary, it's about a 45-minute documentary. It's found on the internet, and it outlines how the Vanderbilt family essentially lost their fortune over the generations. And it outlines the reasons why the family lost their fortune. And it's very interesting to see the different reactions to the Vanderbilt family losing their vast fortune. You know, going from the family, the richest family in the United States, and there were some very wealthy families at the time in the different parts of the United States. For example, the Rockefellers were considered at one point the wealthiest family in the United States, and then you had all kinds of the big wealthy philanthropists that came on the scene. And you could trace the different historical ups and downs of these different families. But this documentary was dealing with the Vanderbilt family, and it started with John Vanderbilt. And he amassed this great fortune. And then he had the decision as to how do you pass this wealth down? How do you pass a family fortune down generation after generation? So his idea was to select one of his children, one of his offspring, and that was his son. And he would give the vast family fortune into this son's hands. And so his son received, one of his sons received the family fortune to manage it, and he lo and behold, he did. He managed it and actually increased it. And I think he doubled the size of the Vanderbilt family fortune. But then when it became apparent that he was nearing the end of his life, he had to make a decision as to what to do with the money. And unfortunately, he, according to this documentary, he broke it up and shared the vast wealth with the members of the family. And the idea that they would themselves keep their fortunes alive by investing and wisely managing the money. But that did not work out. And so the documentary states some of the information in the documentary I don't actually believe. It might have gotten AI generated information. But one of the big headlines in the documentary was that the Vanderbilt family was the wealthiest family in the United States at one point, and now there's not even one member of the family, the heirs, the generations since the Cornelius Vanderbilt fortune, not one of the families even is worth $1 million. And that's what the documentary stated in its headline, but I don't believe that because one of the heirs is the anchor for the CNN News, and he is worth more than $1 million. There's no question about that. And he is part of the Vanderbilt family. He's an heir of Cornelius Vanderbilt. And he is certainly worth more than $1 million. So I'm not sure if the AI-generated statistics are sound and solid in this documentary on that one point, because that seems such a glaring, obviously false statement that not any of his heirs are even worth $1 million. $1 million, it seems like a lot of money to most of us, and it would seem like a lot of $1 million would seem like a big amount to me even, because I don't deal with millions of dollars, and even $1 million of savings or retirement savings for me would be a vast amount. So it seems like a vast amount for most people, I think, the average person. But $1 million, to be worth $1 million, is not that big of a thing today. Your home could be worth more than $1 million, even if you bought it for, say, only $100,000. 30 years ago, it could be worth a lot more than $1 million, especially in California. But a lot of homes go for 400, 500,000 even today, and in 5 years or 10 years, they could be worth easily worth $1 million. So that is a misnomer in the documentary. There are probably a number of different people in the Vanderbilt family who are who earn more or even are worth more than $1 million. That's not a big deal today. But the documentary talks about the problem that the Vanderbilt fortune faced when it was diffused among all of the different family members. And that was the downfall of the family fortune. Now, the original founder of the Vanderbilt fortune, Cornelius Vanderbilt, he had the right idea as far as preserving wealth through generations, and that was to pass it on to only one heir. So that one heir, you would choose amongst your heirs which one you think is responsible enough and capable of to manage this vast fortune. And so he chose his one son, and his son did a good job. But then the next generations who receive sort of the diffused fortune, they squandered it, or they didn't make it a point to grow the vast fortune. Now, the documentary laments that and says, oh, that's terrible, that was bad, because some of the other families, like the Rockefellers, or I think the Kennedy families and so on and so forth, who had vast wealth, they have maintained their family fortune to some degree. Now, you can't go from the richest family in the United States, and I don't know how the Waltons are doing it. Sam Walton, founder of Walmart and so forth, that family is wealthy. I don't know how they're structuring their family wealth. But the documentary seems to feel that the Vanderbilt family failed in this massive way because they didn't preserve their family fortune. But when I see this documentary and I look at this documentary and this family, I look at it differently. I say, well, that's good. That's fine. That's perfectly acceptable. In fact, that was something that probably saved many of the lives of these heirs, a ruined life. Because imagine being a member of the Vanderbilt family and then having that pressure of having to pass along from generation to generation this huge amount of money, this vast wealth. Imagine the pressure that you would feel, that this weight of responsibility, you might say a burden, this huge weight on your shoulder of having to preserve that amount and not lose it and pass it on and invest it wisely. And that would be all consuming in your life, because you wouldn't want to be the one that squandered the wealth, or you wouldn't be the want to be the one where the whole thing fell apart and the fortune was lost. And you would have this big responsibility on you, whether you ask for it or not. And you think of how crippling that responsibility of maintaining this huge, vast fortune. It would be almost like an idol. You're born into this idol. Now, I just got done reading in the Old Testament where David gave his son Solomon the responsibility of building the temple of God. So David set all the materials in place. He got everything organized because it was his original vision to build a temple for God in Jerusalem. And so he was going to do this, except the prophet Nathan came up to him and said, "You are not the one to do it because you are a warrior and you're a man of blood. You've shed a lot of blood. And your son Solomon, who is peaceful, his name is peaceful, peace in Hebrew, shalom, Solomon, and he will be the specific individual who will build a temple." So David said, "Okay, I will get everything ready for my son Solomon to build the temple." So he began to assemble all the resources and materials and the workers and drew up all the plans and everything. And then he appointed his son as king before he died and said, "Here are the preparations and the plans for the temple. Go to it, get it done. I entrust this project with you." So that's a lot of weight. That's a lot of responsibility. That's a big burden on Solomon's life. But that's not as bad as having this vast fortune and saying you have to preserve this and maintain it all your life. Solomon was given a project for sure, and he was given this huge responsibility to build the temple of God, but that wouldn't have consumed his entire life, because that would have only consumed a number of years of his life, and all of the hard work of getting the materials and assembling the workers and drawing up the plans and everything were already done by his father. And so all he had to do was follow the plans, sort of like getting a package from a furniture company and all the parts are there and the instructions, and all you have to do is just assemble it. So that's what Solomon did. And it wasn't a whole life-consuming thing either. But with the Vanderbilt family, if you were an heir, you would have this vast fortune dumped on you, and you were given the solemn duty of passing it on to the next generation, so that the Vanderbilts were always a wealthy family. And that kind of burden, I think, would have cursed a person. If you look at some of the movies that have come out in the last 10 years, for example, I'm thinking of one. There were actually two movies done about John Paul Getty, who was the famous oil and gasoline wealthy individual who made his millions and billions with oil and gas. And his entire life and family were all messed up. Some of his children committed suicide because of the pressures of the Getty fortune. His grandson was basically kidnapped and held for ransom and had his ear cut off, part of his ear cut off, in for ransom to be released, and some millions of dollars was to be given to them, and there was a whole mess there. John Paul Getty was an immoral man. He had mistresses. It was just really a messed up life. His heirs were not healthy people, functioning people. They were riddled with the curse of his wealth that he hung over their heads, and there was always this pressure to do what he wants, or they were cut off, and they depended on him, and then they didn't want to be. It was a mess. And so if you look at some of those movies, I think the most recent movie about John Paul Getty was called The Richest Man on Earth, or The Richest Man in the World, or something like that. And then there was I think a mini series that actually was a 4, 5, 6-part series where it showed the Getty family and the kidnapping of the grandson, and also the inside look at their family. And it was a miserable mess. And you look at that and say, I would never want to be a part of that kind of family. I don't care about the money. I just want to be able to live a life and not be burdened with all of the rigmarole of this wealthy fortune that seems to be more of a curse than a blessing. And you can look at some of the other wealthy families in American history, just American history. If you confine yourself just to that, you will find that a lot of them had turmoil and conflict, and it really wasn't a very nice existence for people in the family. So I would say that the Vanderbilt family actually had things turn out good because the original founder, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the founder of the wealth and the fortune, he got to be rich, and that's what he wanted to be. He strove to grow his wealth and invest and succeed in businesses and so forth, and he achieved his goal. And even his son, his heir, one of his heirs, was able to double that in the next generation. But to have to carry that burden and that in fortune and wealth into the future and cripple the generations that follow. Now, some people say, well, I would love to have that great burden of being a mega millionaire or billionaire. I would love to have that burden. Really? Are you sure? If you look at some of the lottery winners, for example, their case is a little bit different because they didn't grow up with wealth. And so they haven't grown used to dealing with wealth. But still, if you look at the lives of people that have millions and billions of dollars, and you can even look at just contemporary examples. You look at Jeff Bezos. At one point was at least in the top 5 richest men in the United States, at least, maybe the world. And look at his family life. His wife divorced him recently, I think 3 or 4 years ago, and now he's chumming around with a much younger model, and they're on their yacht and they're playing with their expensive toys. But his family life and his married life collapsed. You look at someone like a Bill Gates, who was at one point one of the richest men in the United States, if not the world, and his wife divorced him. And they had a foundation together. They have a foundation together, and they did a lot of charity work and still do. But again, his marriage collapses. Wealthy people, by and large, are not the happiest people because you have to pay a price for pursuing wealth and making that the centerpiece of your life. And Cornelius Vanderbilt, I guess, that was his vision, to grow wealth and make it the center of his life. But for his heirs to do that, each generation, that's a heavy burden to place on future generations when they don't even consent to that. Sure, it would be nice to have the resources, the income, the wealth to start a business or pick out a nice piece of property and have a nice big home and drive nice cars. Sure, there are benefits of wealth, but there are downsides to wealth. There are curses to wealth. And I think most people would say, I'd like the benefits, but I don't want the negative curses of wealth. I don't want to have to look over my shoulder all the time that someone's going to try to steal from me or rip me off or scam me. I don't want to have to worry about what happened, for example, to John Paul Getty. His grandson was kidnapped, and they tried to exact a ransom from him because of his wealth. And there's a lot of pressure. Look at Elon Musk, for example. Elon Musk is perhaps the wealthiest man in the world. And he has to travel with bodyguards. If you've ever seen him exit and enter buildings with cars and stops outside of the road and gets out, and there are 2 or 3 husky bodyguards, security officers who travel wherever he's at, because you can imagine what kind of ransom that he would possibly get if somebody were to kidnap him or kidnap someone in his family. So there are downsizes. There are all kinds of negatives. There are curses to wealth, too. So a lot of people don't think that. So this documentary, it was lamenting the fact that, oh, the Vanderbilts were once the wealthiest family in the world, and now they're just regular people. The heirs are not necessarily wealthy or rich. They're just regular people. Well, I say that's great. That worked out good because Cornelius Vanderbilt could do his thing. He could build his wealth and be seen as the richest man in the United States at some point. And that was his thing. That was what he wanted to do. But he didn't ask his heirs if that's what they wanted to do. And imagine having to make sure that you kept this wealth away from the scammers and the rip-off artists and the con men and thieves who would steal it, and invest it wisely and not squander it and not lose it. Imagine that pressure. Now, again, a lot of people would say, I'd love that pressure. I'd love to challenge myself to not lose that wealth and all of that. Well, in order to not lose it and in order to grow it, like you have to do because of inflation, the dollar's losing its value and so on and so forth. So unless you're investing something wisely and you're able to avoid these huge catastrophic losses, for example, in the 2008 great financial crisis, if you had everything invested in real estate, you might, the family fortune, if it had existed at that point in Vanderbilt's heir, if it was, say, $500 billion or whatever, if you had it all invested in real estate, which for a time was a great investment, but if you had it all invested in real estate, that might have dropped in half. It might be worth $250 billion now. You might have lost a huge amount, which might have taken generations and generations to build up, and you lost it in just one crisis. So there is that pressure, and in order to do it wisely and preserve it and succeed, you would have to make it essentially the central piece of your life. And you have to ask yourself, do I want to make money the centerpiece of my life? There are all kinds of scripture teachings that is a big mistake. Jesus said over and over again, he says, what profit a man to gain the world but lose his soul? So if you're an heir of the Vanderbilt and you have this challenge and you have this mandate to maintain the family fortune, is that going to cost your soul to focus on money all the time? This huge idol, it could become an idol. And it probably was an idol for Cornelius Vanderbilt when he built this. And the documentary goes on that he was a fairly ruthless businessman. And he would come in and put people out of business. His competitors, he would fight them fiercely and drive them out of business and then take over that market. So you have to be it has to be an all-consuming passion of yours to grow your wealth. But what is the price for your soul? Because if you're not spending your time serving God and serving the Lord's, doing the Lord's work, and even donating to the work of the Lord, and you're busy worrying about what your fortune is and is it increasing the way you want it to, that puts you into slavery, of sort of a slavery, a spiritual slavery. Now, Jesus said, he gave the parable of the rich young man. And the rich young man came to Jesus and said, Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go. And so he asked, what must I do to have eternal life? I want life, eternal. And Jesus said to him, sell everything you have, give to the poor, and come follow me. Now, what if you were an heir to the Vanderbilt fortune and Jesus asked you to sell everything and give it to the poor? Would you be able to follow the command of Christ, or would you choose the mandate of your great-great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, to hang on to the wealth and pass it on to the next generation of Vanderbilts? You'd have a conflict. You'd have to make a decision. Am I going to follow Jesus, or am I going to follow Cornelius Vanderbilt and maintain the Vanderbilt fortune? I guess you could pass it on to some other family member and say, I want no part of this because Jesus has called me to follow him wherever he goes, whether that's poverty or wherever. And so I can't be tied down with this big family fortune and this big responsibility and this big idol in my life. So I have to give it up. That would be the correct answer. Now we know what happens in the Bible. The rich young ruler went away because he had a lot of money and he wasn't willing to give it up for God. He wasn't able to follow God wholeheartedly because he wanted the wealth. We also see the passage in the scripture in the New Testament where there is a rich man and he's got grain stored up in his barns and he has more than enough to last him a whole lifetime. And he says, what can I do? Well, here's what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build even bigger barns and put more grain in them. But the parable talks about he was a fool because he died shortly thereafter. And all his vast wealth and all his grain and his big barns come to nothing because he's dead. So he loses it all. Again, you could apply that to this Vanderbilt heir. They would maintain the family fortune over generations, but in the process, they could kill themselves. And for what is it worth? What is it worth? It's not worth clinging to that idol of the family fortune. So I say it's actually a good thing that the Vanderbilt fortune has dwindled and that there isn't this big, huge mega idol worth billions and billions of dollars that is floating through the generations of the Vanderbilts, because there's going to be someone, if they appoint one person in the family to manage the money, who's going to be burdened by that idol, or there are going to be a council of family members, maybe a family council that is responsible for that idol, and their life then is going to be consumed, whether that is a council of 3 or 4 or 5 to 8 family members, or whether each family member gets a vote as to what to do with the fortune. Then it expands the curse of the idol of the fortune to more than just a handful or one single individual, and it affects the life of all of them and puts that burden on their shoulders, and they can't serve the Lord and do what the Lord calls them to do because they've got this big burden, this idol of family inherited wealth that they have to deal with. So just like the rich young ruler, it's tempting to turn down God and go with the family fortune. And I think it was actually a good thing that the Cornelius Vanderbilt heir eventually dispersed that great wealth amongst the family, and it's no longer cooped up in a huge amount. What do you think? We'll see you back next week on another program. God bless.